The mahogany desk in my library creaked as I leaned forward, my weathered fingers tracing the edges of a leather-bound ledger that contained secrets worth more than my entire neighborhood. Behind me, muffled voices drifted through the heavy oak door as my family gathered in the living room, their concerned whispers painting me as a confused old woman who couldn't remember where she'd put her reading glasses. If only they knew that while they thought I was losing my mind, I was actually counting the millions I'd accumulated over 5 decades of careful planning, strategic investments, and a brilliance they'd never bothered to recognize. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Fanny Ellis. I'm 78 years old, and for the past 3 years, my own children have been treating me like a broken relic whose time has passed. They speak about me in hushed tones when they think I can't hear, using phrases like cognitive decline and not the woman she used to be. What they don't understand is that I'm exactly the woman I've always been, only sharper, wiser, and significantly wealthier than any of them could imagine. 3 months ago, I was sitting in Dr. Harrison's sterile office, while my daughter Patricia held my hand like I was a child about to receive devastating news. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the doctor reviewed my latest cognitive assessment, his expression carefully neutral, in the way medical professionals master when they're about to deliver information that will change a family's entire dynamic. "Mrs. Ellis," Dr. Harrison said gently, his eyes moving between Patricia and me, "the tests show some concerning patterns. Memory lapses, difficulty with complex tasks, occasional confusion about dates and times. While we can't make a definitive diagnosis today, these symptoms are consistent with early-stage dementia." I watched Patricia's face crumble as she processed the words. Her grip on my hand tightened, and I could feel her trying not to cry. My son Michael, who'd driven up from Cincinnati for this appointment, leaned forward in his chair with the same expression he'd worn as a little boy when his goldfish died. What none of them knew was that I'd deliberately failed half of those cognitive tests. When Dr. Brienne Harrison asked me to remember a list of words, I'd purposely forgotten apple and telephone. When he'd asked me what year it was, I'd hesitated just long enough to seem confused before answering correctly. When he'd given me simple math problems, I'd fumbled through calculations I could do in my sleep. You see, I'd been planning this moment for months. Not the diagnosis itself, but the perception of cognitive decline that would finally give me the freedom I'd been craving for years. Freedom from Patricia's constant phone calls asking when I was going to move to assisted living. Freedom from Michael's weekly visits where he'd inspect my house like a building inspector looking for code violations. Freedom from my youngest daughter Sandra's gentle but persistent suggestions that I might be happier in a community of peers. "Mom," Patricia said softly as we sat in my 1997 Honda Civic in the parking lot after the appointment, "we need to talk about what this means for your future." I turned to look at my oldest child, this accomplished woman who'd raised 3 children of her own and managed a successful accounting firm, yet still saw me as someone who needed protection and guidance. Patricia had always been the responsible one, the one who'd helped me balance my checkbook when her father died 15 years ago, the one who'd insisted on having my name added to her emergency contact list at the bank. "What do you think it means?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "It means we need to start making some changes. Maybe it's time to consider moving you closer to one of us. Michael has that beautiful guest suite in his new house, and Sandra's been saying for months that she'd love to have you nearby in Portland." I nodded thoughtfully, as if this was the first time I'd considered such possibilities. In reality, I'd been anticipating this conversation for years, watching my children grow increasingly concerned about my ability to live independently. What they couldn't see was that their concern was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I was capable of. "Let me think about it," I told Patricia, which was exactly what she wanted to hear. It made me sound like someone who was still capable of making decisions, but might need guidance to make the right ones. The truth was, I'd been making the right decisions long before any of my children were born. I'd been making the right decisions when I was a 28-year-old widow with 3 small children and a husband who'd left me nothing but debt and a mortgage I couldn't afford. I'd been making the right decisions when I'd taken my late husband's life insurance money and invested it in IBM stock in 1972, instead of using it to pay off the house like everyone advised. I'd been making brilliant decisions for 50 years, building a financial empire that none of them suspected existed, But to my children, I would always be Mom. The woman who'd struggled to make ends meet while they were growing up. The woman who'd clipped coupons and shopped at discount stores and made them wear hand-me-downs. They remembered the woman who'd worked double shifts at the textile factory to put food on the table, not realizing that same woman had been studying financial reports and investment strategies every night after they went to bed. When we got home to my modest 2-story house on Maple Street, the same house where I'd raised my children and lived for 43 years, Patricia walked me to the door like I might forget how to use my key. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was treating me like an invalid while standing in front of a house that I owned outright, a house sitting on property that had appreciated in value by over 400% since I'd bought it. "Mom, do you need me to help you with anything?" Patricia asked, her voice carrying that careful tone people use when they're trying not to sound condescending. "I could stay for dinner, help you sort through some paperwork." "I'm fine, sweetheart," I assured her, unlocking my front door with steady hands. "I think I'll just make some tea and read for a while." After she drove away, I stood in my living room and looked around at the space my children saw as evidence of my declining circumstances. The furniture was older, yes, but it was quality furniture that had lasted decades. The carpet showed wear, but it was clean and well-maintained. The wallpaper in the kitchen was from the 1980s, but it wasn't peeling or faded. What they saw as a house frozen in time, I saw as a home that had served its purpose perfectly. It had sheltered my family, appreciated in value, and required minimal maintenance costs that allowed me to invest my money elsewhere. Every dollar I hadn't spent on unnecessary updates and renovations had gone into building my portfolio. I walked into my kitchen and put the kettle on. The same electric kettle I'd been using for 12 years because it still worked perfectly. While the water heated, I pulled out my tablet, the one device my children knew I owned because Patricia had given it to me for Christmas 2 years ago. What they didn't know was that I'd already owned 3 other tablets and 2 laptops, devices I used for managing my investments and monitoring my accounts. The tablet Patricia had given me was loaded with games and streaming apps, the kinds of things she assumed would keep an elderly woman entertained. The tablets hidden in my bedroom closet contained spreadsheets tracking my real estate investments, my stock portfolio, my cryptocurrency holdings, and my precious metals accounts. As I sipped my Earl Grey tea and watched the evening news on my small kitchen television, I thought about the performance I'd given at Dr. Harrison's office. It hadn't been easy to pretend confusion about tasks I could complete effortlessly, but it had been necessary. My children's perception of my capabilities was the key to maintaining the privacy I needed to continue building my wealth. They thought they were protecting me, but they were actually protecting themselves from a truth they weren't ready to accept. Their mother, the woman they remembered struggling to buy school clothes and Christmas presents, had become wealthier than any of them. The woman they'd grown up seeing balance her checkbook at the kitchen table every month had learned to balance a portfolio worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. The phone rang as I was washing my teacup, and I recognized Patricia's number on the caller ID. "Hi, honey," I answered, making sure my voice sounded tired. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation today. Michael and I want to take you out for lunch tomorrow so we can talk about some options. There's a really nice assisted living community about 10 minutes from my house, and I thought we could at least take a look." I dried my hands on the dish towel and considered my response carefully. "That sounds nice, dear. What time?" "How about noon? We could go to that little Italian place you like." "Perfect. I'll be ready." After I hung up, I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened the closet door. Behind my winter coats and old dresses, hidden in a garment bag that looked like it contained out-of-season clothing, was a filing cabinet that held the documents my children would never think to look for. I pulled out a folder labeled Real Estate Holdings and spread the contents across my bed. Property deeds for 6 rental houses in up-and-coming neighborhoods across 3 different states. Purchase agreements for 2 commercial buildings that generated monthly income higher than what most people earned in a year. Contracts for a small apartment complex in Austin that I'd bought 5 years ago when the area was still considered transitional. Next came the investment portfolio summaries. Stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and index funds, carefully selected and maintained over decades. Companies I'd researched and invested in when they were small startups that had since become household names. Technology stocks I'd bought when my children were still making fun of computers and cell phones. The cryptocurrency folder was relatively new, but it represented one of my most successful investment strategies. While my children rolled their eyes at what they considered internet money, I'd been quietly accumulating digital assets that had increased in value by over 2,000% in the past 5 years. Finally, I opened the folder that contained the summary statements. The numbers that represented the culmination of 50 years of careful planning, strategic thinking, and financial discipline that no one had bothered to notice because they were too busy seeing me as a mother and grandmother rather than as an individual with her own intelligence and capabilities. The total value of my holdings was $47. $3 million. I sat on the edge of my bed, surrounded by evidence of a financial empire that my children couldn't imagine, and felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in what I'd accomplished, starting with nothing and building something extraordinary. Sadness that the people I loved most in the world couldn't see past their assumptions about who I was supposed to be. Tomorrow, I would sit through lunch while Michael and Patricia showed me brochures for assisted living facilities and talked about my declining abilities. I would nod and ask appropriate questions and let them believe they were taking care of me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
And then I would come home to my modest house on Maple Street and continue managing a fortune that dwarfed their combined net worth. The irony was delicious, even if it was lonely. I carefully returned all the documents to their hiding places and changed into my nightgown. As I brushed my teeth, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me had gray hair and wrinkles, the visual markers of age that society uses to determine relevance and capability. But behind those aged brown eyes was a mind that had outperformed financial advisors, real estate agents, and investment brokers for 5 decades. My children saw an elderly woman who needed protection. I saw a financial genius who'd been hiding in plain sight. As I settled into bed with a book, my tablet chimed with a notification. The stock market had closed, and my portfolio had gained another $23,000 that day. I smiled as I turned off the light, thinking about the lunch conversation I'd have to navigate tomorrow. They thought they were planning my future. They had no idea I'd been planning it, successfully, for longer than they'd been alive. The morning of my lunch with Patricia and Michael dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of Chicago weather that makes everything feel muted and serious. I dressed carefully in my best navy blazer and modest pearl earrings, the kind of outfit that would reinforce their image of me as a respectable elderly woman who appreciated their guidance. Patricia arrived at exactly 11:45, always punctual, always prepared. She'd brought an umbrella and insisted on holding my arm as we walked to her car, even though I'd been walking without assistance for 78 years and had no intention of stopping now. "How did you sleep, Mom?" she asked as we drove toward downtown, her voice carrying that careful monitoring tone I'd grown accustomed to. "Pretty well," I replied, which was true. I'd actually slept better than I had in weeks, knowing that my performance yesterday had been successful and that my children were now firmly convinced of my need for their protection. Michael was already waiting at Benedetto's when we arrived, sitting at a corner table with a folder of papers beside his plate. My youngest son had inherited his father's earnest nature and his tendency to over-prepare for every situation. Even as a child, he'd made lists and plans and backup plans for school projects and family vacations. "Hi, Mom," he said, standing to give me a hug that lasted just a moment longer than usual. The kind of hug you give someone you're worried about. We ordered our usual meals. Patricia got the chicken parmesan, Michael ordered the lasagna, and I chose the minestrone soup with a small Caesar salad. The same orders we'd been making at this restaurant for years. A comforting routine that none of us wanted to disrupt. "So," Patricia began once the server had taken our orders, "Michael and I have been doing some research about options for you." Michael opened his folder and pulled out several glossy brochures. "We found some really beautiful communities, Mom. Places where you could have your independence but also have support available when you need it." I examined the brochures with appropriate interest. Sunrise Manor looked like a luxury hotel, with elegant common areas and spacious apartments. Meadowbrook Assisted Living featured a golf course and an art studio. Willow Creek Senior Community advertised gourmet dining and transportation services. "These all look very nice," I said honestly, because they did look nice. They also cost between $4,000 and $8,000 per month, amounts that my children clearly assumed would stretch my limited budget to the breaking point. "The thing is," Patricia said gently, We know money is tight for you. Dad's pension and Social Security don't go very far these days. I nodded sympathetically, as if the cost of assisted living was indeed a major concern. In reality, I could afford to live in the most expensive facility in the country without making a dent in my investment returns. But we've been thinking, Michael continued, maybe this is the right time to sell the house. The real estate market is really strong right now, and that would give you a nice nest egg to work with. Sell the house. The house that had cost me $23,000 in 1979 and was now worth $340,000. The house where I'd raised my children and stored my secrets and built my empire. The house that had appreciated in value by over 1,400%, while serving as the foundation for everything I'd accomplished. Have you had it appraised recently? I asked, genuinely curious about their assessment of the property's value. Well, we looked at some comparable sales in the neighborhood, Patricia said. Houses similar to yours have been selling for around $200,000 to $250,000. I nearly choked on my soup. They'd underestimated the value of my house by at least $100,000, which told me they'd done their research quickly and superficially, probably looking at smaller houses or properties that hadn't been maintained as well as mine. That seems reasonable, I said, filing away yet another piece of evidence that my children, despite their good intentions, had a limited understanding of financial matters. The important thing, Michael said, is that selling the house would give you enough money to live comfortably in one of these communities for several years. And being closer to one of us would mean we could visit more often and help you with appointments and errands. Help me with appointments and errands. The assumption that I needed help with basic life management was both touching and insulting. I'd been managing my own appointments for decades, often scheduling multiple meetings in a single day to review properties, meet with investment advisors, and handle the complex logistics of a diversified portfolio. What do you think, Mom? Patricia asked. Would you like to visit one or two of these places, just to get a feel for what they're like? I folded my hands in my lap and gave them my most thoughtful grandmother expression. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to look. The relief on their faces was immediate and obvious. They'd been prepared for resistance, for arguments about independence and staying in my own home. Instead, they'd gotten compliance and what they interpreted as wisdom. That's wonderful, Michael said. I can call Sunrise Manor this afternoon and set up a tour for next week. As we finished our lunch, I listened to my children discuss my future with the confidence of people who believed they understood my situation completely. They talked about downsizing my belongings, forwarding my mail, and transferring my medical records. They mentioned the importance of staying active and social, as if I'd been living as a hermit instead of managing business relationships across multiple states. What struck me most was their genuine care and concern. They weren't trying to control me or take advantage of me. They truly believed they were helping their aging mother navigate a difficult transition. Their intentions were pure, even if their assumptions were completely wrong. You know, Patricia said as we walked back to her car, I'm really proud of you for being so open to this, Mom. Change is hard at any age, but especially when you've been in the same house for so long. I squeezed her arm affectionately. Sometimes change is exactly what we need, even when we don't realize it. That evening, after Patricia had dropped me off and driven away with promises to call tomorrow with tour arrangements, I sat in my living room and reflected on the strange position I'd put myself in. By allowing my children to believe I needed their help, I'd gained something I'd been craving for years: their undivided attention and involvement in my life. For decades, they'd been too busy with their own careers and families to spend much time with me. Phone calls were brief and focused on practical matters. Visits were scheduled around holidays and special occasions. I'd often felt like an obligation they checked off their lists rather than a person they genuinely wanted to spend time with. Now, suddenly, I was their priority. They were researching options for me, making plans, coordinating their schedules to help me through this transition. The irony was that I'd had to pretend to be failing in order to get the attention I'd wanted when I was succeeding. I pulled out my regular tablet, the one Patricia had given me, and opened the financial news app she'd installed. As I scrolled through articles about market trends and investment strategies, I thought about the performance I'd given at lunch. My children had no idea that while they were explaining basic real estate concepts to me, I was mentally calculating the potential return on investment for each assisted living facility they'd shown me. Sunrise Manor, for instance, was part of a publicly traded company whose stock I'd been watching for 2 years. Their facilities maintained 95% occupancy rates, and their revenue per resident had increased by 8% annually for the past 5 years. If I were looking for an investment opportunity rather than a place to live, their parent company would be an excellent addition to my portfolio. The thought made me smile. My children were trying to spend my money wisely, while I was evaluating the investment potential of their recommendations. We were having completely different conversations, even when we were using the same words. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Sandra's number, my youngest daughter calling from Portland. Mom, Patricia told me about your doctor's appointment and the lunch today. How are you feeling about everything? Sandra had always been the emotional one, the daughter who called just to chat and remembered birthdays and anniversaries without being reminded. She was also the most intuitive of my children, the one most likely to sense when something wasn't quite right. I'm doing okay, honey. It's a lot to process, but your brother and sister are being very helpful. I wish I could be there with you. Portland feels so far away when you're going through something like this. The genuine distress in her voice made my chest tighten with guilt. Sandra was worried about me, probably losing sleep over her mother's, quote, cognitive decline, and she was too far away to help in the way that Patricia and Michael could. I know you'd be here if you could, I assured her, but you have your own life and responsibilities. Mom, you're my responsibility too. You're not just someone I'm related to, you're my mother. The person who taught me how to be strong and independent and smart about money. Smart about money. If only she knew how smart I'd actually become. Sandra, I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm very proud of all of you. You've all built good lives for yourselves, and that's all any parent really wants. Don't talk like that, she said, her voice breaking slightly. You're going to be fine. This is just a new chapter. Not an ending. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room and felt the weight of what I'd set in motion. My children's concern was real. Their love was genuine, and their desire to help was motivated by decades of watching me sacrifice for their benefit. They were trying to repay a debt they felt they owed me, not realizing that I'd already collected interest on their success in ways they couldn't imagine. I turned on the lamp beside my chair and opened one of my investment books, a dense analysis of emerging market opportunities that I'd been working through for the past month. As I read about global economic trends and currency fluctuations, I thought about the strange duality of my existence. By day, I was Fanny Ellis, aging mother and grandmother, someone who needed guidance and protection and careful monitoring. By night, I was a financial strategist, whose decisions affected millions of dollars, and whose instincts had been proven right over and over again for 50 years. Tomorrow, I would tour Sunrise Manor with Patricia and Michael, asking appropriate questions about meal plans and activity schedules, while mentally evaluating their business model and profit margins. I would let them explain things to me that I already understood better than they did, and I would continue building a fortune they couldn't conceive of. The performance was exhausting, but it was also liberating. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, playing the long game, staying several moves ahead, and protecting the secret that had become the most valuable asset in my portfolio. My anonymity. The tour of Sunrise Manor was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, which meant I had exactly 3 days to prepare for what would essentially be an elaborate theatrical performance. Patricia had offered to pick me up, but I'd insisted on driving myself, claiming I needed to maintain some sense of independence while I still could. What I really needed was the freedom to make a quick stop at my safety deposit box at First Citizens Bank. Monday morning found me sitting in the bank's vault room, surrounded by the quiet hum of climate control systems and the soft overhead lighting that made everything feel suspended in time. My safety deposit box was larger than most people needed. But then again, most people didn't have 50 years' worth of careful documentation to store. I pulled out a manila folder labeled Sunrise Manor Research and spread its contents across the small table. Financial statements for Meridian Healthcare Corporation, the publicly traded company that owned Sunrise Manor and 43 other assisted living facilities across the Midwest. Quarterly earnings reports dating back 5 years. Analysis reports from 3 different investment firms. Property acquisition records showing their expansion strategy. What my children saw as a potential home for their aging mother, I saw as a business opportunity that had been underperforming in the current market. Meridian's stock price had dropped 18% over the past 18 months due to increased competition and rising labor costs. Their occupancy rates were still strong, but their profit margins were shrinking as they struggled to maintain their premium pricing model while managing increased expenses. I made notes in the margins of their most recent annual report, calculating the potential impact of various market scenarios on their long-term viability. If their stock price dropped another 10%, it would represent an excellent entry point for a significant investment. The irony of potentially buying into the company that owned the facility where my children wanted me to live was not lost on me. After returning the documents to the safety deposit box, I drove home and spent the rest of Monday afternoon preparing for my performance. I practiced looking confused by simple questions, hesitating before answering things I knew perfectly well, and expressing uncertainty about decisions I'd already analyzed thoroughly. The hardest part was calibrating the level of my apparent decline. Too much confusion would worry my children unnecessarily and might prompt them to seek more aggressive medical interventions. Too little would undermine the narrative I'd established and potentially expose the gaps in my performance. I settled on what I privately called selective uncertainty, a pattern of being sharp about some things while seeming foggy about others. I would remember personal details about my children's lives but struggle with dates and numbers. I would follow complex conversations but occasionally lose track of where we were going or why we were there. Tuesday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather and clear skies, the kind of perfect autumn day that makes everything seem more hopeful than it actually is. I dressed in my most grandmotherly outfit, a floral print dress with a matching cardigan, sensible walking shoes, and the pearl necklace my husband had given me for our 20th anniversary. Patricia and Michael were already waiting in the parking lot of Sunrise Manor when I arrived, both of them checking their phones and looking like people who had important places to be after this obligation was fulfilled. The building itself was impressive, a modern structure designed to look residential rather than institutional, with landscaped gardens and a circular driveway that suggested expensive attention to detail. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Michael asked as we walked toward the main entrance, his hand hovering near my elbow in case I needed support I definitely didn't require. "A little nervous," I admitted, which was actually true. Not nervous about the tour, but nervous about maintaining my performance in front of trained professionals who dealt with cognitive decline every day. The lobby was everything the brochure had promised. Elegant furniture arranged in conversational groupings, fresh flowers on every table, and classical music playing softly in the background. It looked like the kind of place where wealthy people went to age gracefully, which was exactly what it was designed to be. Our tour guide was a woman named Mrs. Chen, probably in her 50s, with the kind of warm but professional demeanor that suggested years of experience helping families navigate difficult decisions. She shook hands with each of us and immediately focused her attention on me rather than my children, which I appreciated even as I prepared to disappoint her expectations. "Mrs. Ellis, I'm so pleased to meet you. Your children have told me a little about your situation, and I want you to know that we specialize in helping people maintain their independence while having access to support when they need it." I smiled and nodded, letting a slight tremor show in my hands as I reached for the welcome packet she offered. "That sounds wonderful. I've been living on my own for so long, the idea of having neighbors again is actually quite appealing." We began our tour with the common areas, a library with floor-to-ceiling windows and comfortable reading chairs, a dining room that looked like it belonged in an upscale restaurant, an activities center with art supplies and exercise equipment. Everything was designed to feel luxurious and homelike, rather than medical or institutional. "Our residents tell us that one of the things they appreciate most is the sense of community," Mrs. Chen explained as we walked through a lounge area where several elderly people were playing cards and chatting. Many of them say they're more socially active here than they were in their previous homes. I watched the card players with genuine interest, noting their apparent health and engagement. These weren't people warehoused in a medical facility. They were people who'd made a lifestyle choice. The distinction was important, both for my performance and for my actual assessment of the business model. "What about the cost?" Patricia asked, which was the question I'd been waiting for. We want to make sure this is sustainable for Mom long term. Mrs. Chen launched into a detailed explanation of their pricing structure, monthly fees, and additional services. The base cost was $4,200 per month for a one-bedroom apartment, with additional charges for meal plans, housekeeping, and personal care services. Total monthly costs could easily reach $6,000 to $7,000, depending on the level of support required. I watched my children's faces as they processed the numbers, seeing them mentally calculate how long my fictional nest egg would last. They were trying to hide their concern, but I could see Patricia doing math in her head and Michael glancing at me with worry about how I was handling the financial reality. Is there financial assistance available? Michael asked carefully, clearly trying not to embarrass me by suggesting I might not be able to afford their services. We do work with some long-term care insurance policies, Mrs. Chen replied diplomatically, and we're happy to discuss payment options that might work for your family's situation. We toured several apartments, each one beautifully appointed with modern appliances, spacious closets, and large windows that filled the rooms with natural light. The one-bedroom units were larger than I'd expected, easily 800 square feet with separate living and sleeping areas. The two-bedroom apartments were genuinely luxurious, with enough space for personal furniture and plenty of storage. What do you think, Mom? Patricia asked as we stood in one of the model apartments, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the facility's garden. I walked slowly around the space, touching surfaces and opening cabinets like someone trying to imagine living there. In reality, I was evaluating the quality of construction, the efficiency of the layout, and the long-term maintenance costs that would affect the facility's profitability. It's very nice, I said eventually. Much nicer than I expected. But it's also quite expensive, isn't it? The look that passed between my children was exactly what I'd been aiming for. Concern mixed with determination to solve a problem they perceived as beyond my ability to handle alone. Don't worry about the cost right now, Michael said firmly. Let's focus on whether this feels like somewhere you could be happy. Mrs. Chen showed us the dining room during lunch service, and I was genuinely impressed by what I saw. The meals looked restaurant quality, served on real china with cloth napkins and fresh flowers on every table. Residents were dressed nicely and engaged in animated conversations. The atmosphere was social and lively rather than institutional and subdued. We have a chef who trained at the Culinary Institute, Mrs. Chen explained, and we offer 3 meal options every day, plus a lighter menu for people who prefer smaller portions or have dietary restrictions. I asked several questions about the meal service, playing the role of someone who'd been cooking for herself for decades and was nervous about giving up that independence. My children seemed pleased that I was engaging with the practical details, interpreting it as a sign that I was seriously considering the move. The truth was, I was engaging with the details because I was genuinely curious about the operational efficiency of their food service program. Labor costs were one of the biggest challenges facing assisted living facilities, and their approach to meal preparation and service would significantly impact their profit margins. Our final stop was the Wellness Center, which included a small gym, a physical therapy suite, and offices for the medical staff who provided on-site services. This was where the conversation took a more serious turn. We have a geriatrician who visits twice a week, Mrs. Chen explained, and our nursing staff can help coordinate care with residents' existing physicians. We also have relationships with specialists who can provide services here, rather than requiring trips to outside appointments. I nodded thoughtfully, as if this was exactly the kind of support I'd been needing. In reality, I was in better health than most people 20 years younger, but I played the role of someone who found the idea of convenient medical care reassuring. That sounds very helpful, I said. Driving to appointments has been getting more difficult lately. It was a complete lie. I'd driven myself to 3 different cities in the past month to meet with property managers and investment advisors, navigating unfamiliar streets and complex parking situations without any difficulty. But it was the kind of lie my children expected to hear, and it reinforced their narrative about my declining capabilities. As we finished our tour and returned to the lobby, Mrs. Chen provided us with additional paperwork and price lists. She also gave me a small gift bag containing branded items, a coffee mug, a pen, and a small calendar with photos of the facility's gardens. "Take your time thinking about everything," she said warmly. "This is a big decision, and we want you to feel completely comfortable with whatever choice you make." In the parking lot, my children were clearly energized by what they'd seen. The facility had exceeded their expectations, and they were already talking about next steps. "Mom, what did you honestly think?" Patricia asked. "Could you see yourself living there?" I leaned against my car and looked back at the building, taking my time to respond in a way that would seem thoughtful rather than calculating. "It's beautiful," I said finally. "Much nicer than I thought it would be." The people seemed happy, and the staff was very professional. "But," Michael prompted, sensing my hesitation, "but it's a big change. And it's expensive. I keep thinking about what your father would say about spending that much money every month." The mention of their father was strategic. My late husband had been notoriously frugal, the kind of man who saved aluminum foil and reused plastic bags. Invoking his memory would make my children think about cost in emotional rather than purely practical terms. "Dad would want you to be safe and happy," Patricia said firmly. "He wouldn't want you to struggle alone just to save money." "I know you're right," I replied. "I just need some time to think about it all." We agreed that I would consider what we'd seen and that we'd talk again in a few days. As I drove home, I reflected on the morning's performance and how well my children had played their assigned roles. They'd asked the right questions, expressed appropriate concerns, and demonstrated genuine care for my well-being. They'd also revealed their assumptions about my financial situation and their willingness to help me navigate what they perceived as a crisis. What they didn't know was that while they were calculating whether I could afford $6,000 per month for assisted living, I was calculating whether Meridian Healthcare Corporation was undervalued enough to justify a significant investment. The monthly cost of living at Sunrise Manor represented less than 4% of my average monthly investment returns. I could afford to live there for the rest of my life without touching my principal, while simultaneously buying enough stock in their parent company to potentially influence their business decisions. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and the welcome packet from Sunrise Manor spread across my table. I read through their marketing materials with the dual perspective of a potential resident and a potential investor, finding both roles equally fascinating. Their target demographic was exactly what I appeared to be: affluent older adults who valued luxury and independence but recognized the need for support services. Their average resident stayed for 4 years and paid approximately $250,000 in total fees, making each occupied unit worth roughly $62,500 annually in revenue. With 94% occupancy across their portfolio and an average of 80 units per facility, Meridian was generating substantial cash flow. Their challenge was managing costs while maintaining the high-quality experience that justified their premium pricing. I opened my laptop and spent an hour researching their recent quarterly results and analyst reports. Their stock was trading at $34.50 per share, down from a high of $42.00 18 months ago. Several analysts had downgraded their recommendations due to concerns about competitive pressure and rising labor costs. From an investment perspective, this looked like exactly the kind of temporary setback that created opportunities for patient investors. The fundamentals of their business were strong, and the demographic trends were overwhelmingly positive. The baby boom generation was entering their peak years for assisted living, creating a growing market for exactly the services Meridian provided. I made a note to contact my broker in the morning and discuss a potential position in Meridian Healthcare Corporation. Not a massive investment, but significant enough to matter. Maybe $500,000 to start, with the possibility of increasing my position if the stock price continued to decline. The phone rang as I was closing my laptop, and Sandra's number appeared on the caller ID. "Mom, how did the tour go today?" Patricia sent me some pictures of the place, and it looks gorgeous. "It was very nice," I told her. "Much nicer than I expected. The people seemed happy, and the facilities were impressive." "But you don't sound excited about it." Sandra had always been perceptive, able to read emotions in my voice that her siblings missed. It was both endearing and potentially problematic for maintaining my performance. "I think I'm just overwhelmed by all the changes," I said, which was partially true. Managing a double life was more emotionally exhausting than I'd anticipated. "Mom, can I ask you something?" And I want you to be completely honest with me." My heart skipped a beat. "Of course, honey. Are you scared? About the diagnosis, about moving, about everything that's happening?" I considered my answer carefully. The truth was complicated. I wasn't scared about my cognitive abilities because I knew they were fine. I wasn't scared about money because I had more than enough. But I was scared about maintaining deception with people I loved. And I was scared about what would happen when the truth eventually came out. "I'm scared about losing myself," I said finally, which was perhaps the most honest thing I'd said to any of my children in months. "You're not going to lose yourself," Sandra said firmly. "You're going to be in a new place with new people, but you're still going to be you. You're still going to be the woman who taught me to balance a checkbook and comparison shop and never settle for less than I deserve." Her words hit me harder than I'd expected. I had taught my children those things, along with dozens of other practical skills and life lessons. What I'd never taught them was how to see their mother as anything other than their mother. "Sandra, I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'm proud of the woman you've become. You're smart and independent and strong, and those qualities will serve you well no matter what life throws at you." "Mom, you're talking like you're going somewhere permanent." "This is just assisted living, not hospice care." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling the weight of my deception more heavily than I had since this whole charade began. My children's love for me was genuine and unconditional, based on decades of shared experiences and mutual support. Their concern for my well-being was motivated by gratitude for everything I'd done for them over the years. They were trying to take care of me the same way I'd taken care of them when they were children, with patience, wisdom, and an assumption that I needed their protection. The role reversal was natural and inevitable, except that in this case, it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my actual capabilities. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened the closet where I kept my hidden files. Among the investment documents and property records was a folder I rarely opened, one labeled Personal Reflections. Inside were letters I'd written to myself over the years, documenting my thoughts and decisions as I built my financial empire. I pulled out a letter dated 5 years ago, written just after my husband's death, when I'd first begun to seriously consider what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. "Today I paid off the mortgage on the 3rd rental property," I'd written. "Harold would be amazed at what I've accomplished, though I'm not sure he'd understand how I did it. He always saw money as something to be saved rather than invested, something to be protected rather than grown. I loved him, but I'm discovering that I have capabilities he never recognized and never encouraged." Reading my own words from 5 years ago felt like receiving advice from a trusted friend. The woman who'd written that letter had been clear about her goals and confident in her abilities. She'd also been lonely, surrounded by financial success, but isolated by the secrecy required to maintain it. The woman reading that letter now was facing a similar choice. I could continue building my wealth in secret, maintaining the performance that kept my children involved in my life while hiding the truth about who I really was. Or I could find a way to reveal my capabilities without destroying the relationships that mattered most to me. The problem was that my children's image of me as someone who needed their protection had become the foundation of our current closeness. If I revealed my true financial situation and cognitive sharpness, would they still make time for lunch dates and concern calls and family meetings? Or would they return to their busy lives, secure in the knowledge that Mom was fine and didn't need their attention? I put the letter back in its folder and closed the closet door, no closer to resolving the contradiction that had come to define my life. Tomorrow, I would continue playing the role of the aging mother who needed guidance and support. Tomorrow, I would also continue making financial decisions that would affect millions of dollars and potentially change the trajectory of several companies. The performance was becoming easier with practice, but the emotional cost was becoming harder to bear. Every day that I allowed my children to believe I was declining was another day that I betrayed their trust and undermined the foundation of our relationships. But every day that I maintained the deception was also another day that I got to experience their love and attention in ways I'd been craving for years. The next morning brought a phone call that would change everything, though I didn't recognize its significance at the time. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and I almost let it go to voicemail before deciding to answer. Mrs. Ellis? This is Jennifer Walsh from Meridian Healthcare Corporation. I understand you toured one of our facilities yesterday, and I wanted to personally follow up to see if you have any questions. Jennifer Walsh. I knew that name from the research I'd done the night before. She was Meridian's Vice President of Business Development, a senior executive who wouldn't normally be calling individual prospects. Her involvement suggested that someone had flagged my tour as significant, though I couldn't imagine why. That's very kind of you to call, I said, automatically shifting into my grandmother voice. The tour was lovely. Everyone was very professional. I'm glad to hear that. Mrs. Chen mentioned that you seemed very engaged and asked excellent questions about our services. She was impressed by your attention to detail. Too much attention to detail, apparently. I'd been so focused on evaluating their business model that I'd forgotten to maintain my performance as someone with cognitive challenges. I've always been curious about how things work, I said, trying to sound like someone whose curiosity was charming rather than analytical. My late husband used to tease me about asking too many questions. Well, I think questions are important when you're making a decision this significant. I wanted you to know that we have some additional options that might interest you. Would you be available to meet for coffee sometime this week? I'd love to discuss some possibilities that weren't covered in yesterday's tour. Additional options. That was either very good news or very bad news, depending on what she'd discovered about my background. I suppose that would be all right, I said, though I should mention that my children are very involved in helping me with these decisions. Of course. Would you prefer that they join us? Let me talk to them and see what works best for everyone. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone and trying to figure out what had just happened. Senior executives at major corporations didn't personally follow up with individual prospects unless something had caught their attention. Either I'd impressed them with my potential as a resident, or I'd concerned them with my questions about their operation. I called Patricia and explained about the follow-up call, presenting it as evidence of Sunrise Manor's excellent customer service rather than a potential problem. That's wonderful, Mom, Patricia said. It shows they're really interested in having you there. When are you meeting with her? We haven't set a time yet. She said I could bring you and Michael if I wanted. I think that's a great idea. You shouldn't have to navigate these conversations alone. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Patricia was offering to protect me from a business conversation that I was probably better equipped to handle than anyone else involved. We arranged to meet Jennifer Walsh on Thursday afternoon at a coffee shop near Sunrise Manor. I spent Wednesday preparing for what I expected to be either an opportunity or a crisis, possibly both. If Jennifer had done research on my background, she might have discovered that the modest widow my children described didn't match the property records and financial transactions associated with my name. If she was smart enough to connect those dots, she might realize that I was far from the vulnerable elderly woman I appeared to be. On the other hand, if she was simply trying to close a high-value sale, she might be prepared to offer incentives or special arrangements that would reveal more about Meridian's business practices than she intended. Either way, Thursday's meeting would be the first real test of whether my performance could withstand professional scrutiny from someone trained to evaluate potential residents and their financial capabilities. I spent Wednesday evening reviewing everything I knew about Jennifer Walsh and Meridian Healthcare Corporation, preparing for a conversation that would determine whether my carefully constructed deception could survive contact with the real business world. Thursday afternoon arrived with an unexpected chill in the air, the kind of weather that makes you question whether you've dressed appropriately for whatever challenges the day might bring. I chose my outfit carefully, a conservative gray suit that could be interpreted as either grandmotherly formality or subtle business attire, depending on the observer's expectations. Patricia picked me up at 2:15, chattering nervously about traffic and parking as we drove toward the coffee shop. She'd taken the afternoon off from her accounting firm, claiming she wanted to be there to support me through what she assumed would be a complicated financial discussion. Remember, Mom, you don't have to commit to anything today, she said as we pulled into the parking lot of Brewster's Cafe, a trendy spot with exposed brick walls and the kind of artisanal coffee menu that intimidated people who just wanted a regular cup with cream and sugar. This is just an information-gathering meeting. Michael was already waiting inside, sitting at a corner table with his laptop bag and a legal pad covered in handwritten notes. My middle child had always been the most methodical of my three, the one who researched every major purchase and compared insurance policies and read the fine print on contracts. Seeing him prepared for this meeting with the same thoroughness he brought to everything else made my chest tight with affection and guilt. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he asked as I settled into the chair across from him. "Nervous about this conversation?" "A little," I admitted, which was absolutely true. The difference was that I was nervous about maintaining my performance under professional scrutiny, while he assumed I was nervous about understanding complex financial arrangements. Jennifer Walsh arrived exactly on time, which I appreciated both as someone who valued punctuality and as someone who was evaluating her professionalism. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested years of successful business negotiations. "Mrs. Ellis, it's wonderful to meet you in person," she said, extending her hand with a firm grip that lasted just the right amount of time. "And you must be Patricia and Michael. Mrs. Chen told me how involved and supportive you've been throughout this process." We ordered our drinks, and I watched Jennifer interact with the barista. She was friendly but efficient, the kind of person who treated service workers with respect while maintaining appropriate boundaries. It was a small detail, but it told me something about her character that would be relevant to whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Mrs. Ellis," Jennifer began once we were settled with our coffee, "I wanted to meet with you because your tour yesterday raised some interesting possibilities that we don't typically discuss during our standard presentations." Interesting possibilities. My internal alarm system activated immediately, though I kept my expression neutral and slightly confused, as if I couldn't imagine what possibilities she might be referring to. "I'm not sure I understand," I said, letting a small tremor creep into my voice. "I thought the tour covered everything." Patricia leaned forward protectively. "Is there something specific you need to discuss about Mom's situation?" Jennifer's smile was warm but professional as she pulled a folder from her briefcase. "Actually, it's quite positive. Based on your questions during the tour and some background research we conducted, it appears that Mrs. Ellis might be an excellent candidate for our Founders Circle program." Founders Circle program. I'd seen no mention of this in any of the marketing materials or on their website. Either it was a new initiative or it was something they only offered to select residents under specific circumstances. "What exactly is the Founders Circle program?" Michael asked, his pen poised over his legal pad. "It's an opportunity for residents who have both the financial capacity and the interest to become more involved in the operations and future development of our facilities," Jennifer explained. "Members of the Founders Circle enjoy enhanced amenities and services, but they also have input into facility improvements and expansion plans." Enhanced amenities and input into operations. In other words, they were looking for wealthy residents who wanted to invest additional money in exchange for preferential treatment and a voice in business decisions. "That sounds very exclusive," Patricia said carefully. "What kind of financial capacity are we talking about?" Jennifer opened her folder and pulled out a glossy brochure I hadn't seen before. The cover featured photos of luxury apartments that were significantly larger than what we'd toured, along with amenities that hadn't been part of yesterday's presentation. "Founders Circle membership requires an upfront contribution of $250,000 in addition to the standard monthly fees," Jennifer explained. "In exchange, members receive priority placement in our premium units, access to concierge services, and quarterly meetings with our executive team to discuss facility operations and future plans." I felt Patricia and Michael tense beside me as they processed the number. $250,000 was far beyond what they assumed I could afford, and I could practically hear them calculating how to politely decline without embarrassing me. "That's quite a substantial amount," I said slowly, as if I were struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the investment. "It is," Jennifer agreed. "But for the right resident, someone who values luxury and wants to be actively involved in shaping their living environment, it can be an excellent opportunity. The contribution is also refundable if a member decides to leave the facility, minus a small administrative fee." Michael cleared his throat diplomatically. "Ms. Walsh, I appreciate you thinking of our mother for this program, but I'm not sure it's within our current financial parameters." "Of course," Jennifer said smoothly. "I should mention that we also offer financing options for qualified applicants." The contribution can be structured as a series of payments over time, and we work with several banks that specialize in senior housing investments. Senior housing investments. The terminology was telling. She wasn't talking about assisted living costs. She was talking about investment opportunities disguised as premium housing options. Could you tell us more about what kind of input Founders Circle members have? I asked, genuinely curious about the business model they were proposing. Jennifer's eyes brightened, and I could see that she'd interpreted my question as serious interest, rather than analytical curiosity. Members meet quarterly with our regional management team to review operational performance, discuss resident satisfaction surveys, and provide feedback on proposed improvements. They also have priority consideration for new amenities and services we're developing. And the financial performance of the facility, I asked before I could stop myself. Do members receive regular reports on occupancy rates and revenue projections? The question hung in the air for a moment too long, and I realized I'd stepped out of character. A confused elderly woman worried about the cost of assisted living wouldn't be asking about revenue projections and operational performance metrics. Patricia jumped in quickly, trying to cover for what she assumed was my confusion about the program's details. I think what Mom is trying to ask is whether this is a sound financial decision from her perspective, she said. We want to make sure we understand all the implications before considering such a significant commitment. Jennifer nodded, but I caught her studying my face with new interest. She was sharp enough to recognize that my question had been more sophisticated than my children's explanation suggested. That's exactly the kind of thoughtful analysis we appreciate from our Founders Circle candidates, she said carefully. We provide quarterly financial summaries to all members, and we're very transparent about our operational metrics and growth projections. I realized that I was at a crossroads. I could continue playing the confused grandmother role and let this opportunity pass, or I could reveal enough of my actual capabilities to engage seriously with what appeared to be a legitimate business proposition. Jennifer, I said, making a decision that would change everything. Could you give me a few days to review the materials and discuss this with my financial advisor? The silence that followed was profound. Patricia and Michael stared at me with expressions of complete bewilderment, as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Your financial advisor? Patricia asked slowly. Yes, dear. Mr. Steinberg at Midwest Investment Group. I've been working with him for several years on my portfolio management. Jennifer's eyebrows rose slightly, and I could see her reevaluating everything she thought she knew about my situation. Of course, she said. Take all the time you need. I'll prepare a complete information packet with our financial projections and operational reports. Would you like me to send it directly to your advisor, or would you prefer to review it first? Send it to me first, please. I like to understand these things before I involve my advisor in the details. Michael was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Mom, what financial advisor? What portfolio? The moment had arrived sooner than I'd planned, but there was no way to retreat now without making the situation worse. Children, I said gently, I think it's time we had a more comprehensive conversation about my financial situation. The ride home was conducted in complete silence, broken only by Patricia's occasional glances in the rearview mirror and Michael's aggressive note-taking in the passenger seat. I sat in the back seat like a prisoner being transported to an interrogation, watching familiar neighborhoods pass by, while contemplating how to explain 50 years of financial deception to people who thought they knew everything about my life. We went directly to my house, where Patricia made coffee with shaking hands while Michael paced around my living room like a caged animal. The dynamic had shifted completely. Instead of protective children helping their aging mother navigate a difficult decision, they'd become confused investigators trying to understand what they'd missed about someone they thought they knew completely. Mom, Patricia said as she set mugs of coffee on my kitchen table, we need you to explain what just happened back there. I looked at my children, these accomplished adults who'd succeeded in their own careers and built their own families, and saw the confusion and hurt in their faces. They felt betrayed, even though they couldn't yet articulate why. What would you like to know? I asked. Everything, Michael said firmly. Start with this financial advisor you've apparently been working with for several years. I walked to my phone and pulled up my contacts, scrolling to David Steinberg's number and showing them the screen. David Steinberg, certified financial planner at Midwest Investment Group. I've been his client since 2018. Patricia stared at the phone like it was evidence of a crime. Mom, in 2018 you told us you were having trouble managing Dad's pension paperwork. You asked me to help you organize your financial documents. I did ask for your help, I agreed, but not because I couldn't manage the paperwork. I asked for your help because I wanted to spend time with you, and I knew you'd feel useful and needed if I let you organize something for me. The words hung in the air like an accusation. I'd manipulated my daughter's love and concern to get attention I'd wanted but been too proud to ask for directly. What else haven't you told us? Michael asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. I stood up and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where my children had played as kids, where I'd hung laundry and planted gardens and made hundreds of small decisions that had shaped our family's life. I haven't told you that I'm worth approximately $47 million. The coffee mugs hit the table with enough force to slosh liquid onto the wood surface. Patricia made a choking sound, and Michael stopped pacing so abruptly that he nearly lost his balance. 47 million? Patricia whispered. Give or take a few $100,000, depending on market fluctuations. Michael sat down heavily in one of my kitchen chairs. How is that possible? Dad's pension was modest, Social Security isn't that much, and you worked at the textile factory. I did work at the textile factory, I confirmed, for 12 years until 1987. But I also started investing your father's life insurance money in 1972, and I've been building a portfolio ever since. I opened my laptop, which was sitting on the kitchen counter, and pulled up my investment tracking spreadsheet. The document showed a complex array of stocks, bonds, real estate holdings, and alternative investments that represented 50 years of careful financial planning. This can't be real, Patricia said, leaning over my shoulder to stare at the screen. These numbers are impossible. The IBM stock alone is worth over $3 million, I explained. I bought it in 1972 for $8,000. Apple stock purchased in 1997 is worth approximately $2 million. The real estate holdings are valued at $12 million across 6 properties in 3 states. I scrolled through the spreadsheet, showing them investment after investment that had grown exponentially over decades of patient accumulation and strategic timing. The rental properties generate approximately $18,000 per month in income. The dividend portfolio pays another $12,000 quarterly. The municipal bonds provide tax-free income of $6,000 monthly. Michael was staring at the screen like he was trying to decode a foreign language. Mom, where did you learn to do this? How did you know which stocks to buy? I read, I said simply. I studied. I learned. After your father died, I realized that financial security was something I'd have to create for myself. So I educated myself about investing and started small. Patricia sank into a chair beside her brother. All these years, while we've been worried about your finances, you've been secretly wealthy? I wasn't secretive because I wanted to deceive you, I said, though I knew that explanation wouldn't satisfy them. I was private because wealth changes relationships. It changes how people see you and how they interact with you. We're your children, Michael said, his voice rising. We wouldn't have treated you differently because you had money. I looked at him with as much love and patience as I could manage. Michael, 3 hours ago you were worried about whether I could afford assisted living. You and Patricia have spent months researching financial assistance programs and discussing how to help me manage my limited resources. Would you have done any of that if you'd known I could buy the entire facility without affecting my lifestyle? The silence that followed was answer enough. My children's concern and attention over the past few months had been motivated by their perception of my vulnerability. If they'd known I was financially secure, they would have assumed I could handle everything myself. But the doctor's appointment, Patricia said slowly, the cognitive tests, the diagnosis. This was the part I'd been dreading most. The financial deception was one thing, but the medical performance involved their emotional well-being in ways that felt more serious. I may have performed slightly below my actual capabilities during those assessments, I admitted. You faked having dementia? Michael's voice was flat with disbelief. I didn't fake dementia. I simply allowed the doctor to reach conclusions based on test results that weren't entirely representative of my actual cognitive function. Patricia's face was pale with shock and hurt. Mom, do you understand what you put us through? The worry, the planning, the discussions about your future? We've been terrified that we were losing you. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. In my focus on maintaining my financial privacy and ensuring my children's attention, I'd caused them genuine emotional pain. Their fear about my cognitive decline had been real, even if the decline itself was manufactured. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it completely. I never intended to cause you pain. I just wanted to spend time with you, to be involved in your lives in a way that felt meaningful. So you pretended to be sick? Michael asked. I pretended to need help, I corrected, because it was the only way I could think of to get the kind of attention and involvement I'd been missing since you all became adults with your own lives. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of traffic on Maple Street. My children sat processing revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about their mother, while I waited to learn whether our relationships could survive the truth I'd finally decided to tell. Show us everything, Patricia said finally. If we're going to understand this, we need to see everything. For the next 3 hours, I walked them through 50 years of financial decisions. I showed them my first investment ledger, handwritten entries documenting stock purchases made with grocery money saved through careful coupon clipping and bargain hunting. I explained how I'd reinvested every dividend, how I'd researched companies by reading annual reports in the public library, how I'd gradually expanded from individual stocks to real estate to more sophisticated investment strategies. I pulled out property deeds for rental houses they'd never heard of, located in cities they didn't know I'd ever visited. I showed them photographs of commercial buildings I owned, apartment complexes that generated monthly income higher than their annual salaries. This building in Austin, Michael said, staring at a photo of a modest office complex. You own this entire building? I bought it in 2019 for $800,000. It's currently valued at $1. $2 million and generates $15,000 monthly in rental income. Patricia was looking through bank statements that showed account balances with so many zeros they seemed like typographical errors. Mom, this checking account alone has more money than I've saved in my entire career. That's my operating account, I explained. I keep about 6 months of expenses there, plus funds for new investment opportunities. I showed them my cryptocurrency portfolio, which had grown from a $50,000 initial investment to over $400,000 in current value. I explained my precious metals holdings, my international mutual funds, and my carefully diversified bond portfolio. The goal, I said as we sat surrounded by documents that told the story of my secret financial life, was always security. I never wanted to be dependent on anyone, and I never wanted you to feel responsible for supporting me. But we want to be responsible for you, Patricia said, tears in her eyes. We want to take care of you the way you took care of us. And you have been taking care of me, I assured her. Just not financially. Michael was studying a spreadsheet that tracked my investment performance over the past decade. Mom, these returns are incredible. You've consistently outperformed most professional fund managers. I had time, I said. Time to research. Time to wait for the right opportunities. Time to let compound interest work its magic. Most importantly, I had patience. I never needed the money immediately, so I could afford to make decisions based on long-term potential rather than short-term necessity. As the afternoon turned to evening, my children gradually processed what they'd learned. The mother they'd thought they were protecting was actually more financially sophisticated than either of them. The woman they'd been trying to help manage her limited resources was actually wealthier than most people they knew. What about the Founders Circle program? Patricia asked as we finished going through the last of my financial documents. Are you actually interested in that? I considered the question carefully. I'm interested in understanding it better. The investment structure is intriguing, and I'd like to evaluate whether it represents a good opportunity. As an investment, Michael said slowly, not as a place to live. As both, potentially. The truth is, I have been thinking about my living situation. This house is larger than I need, and I do sometimes feel isolated here. But I want to make decisions based on what I actually want, not what other people think I should want. Sandra called, just as we were finishing our conversation, and I found myself facing the prospect of explaining everything again to my youngest daughter. Patricia took the phone and launched into a summary that sounded like she was reporting on a completely different family than the one she'd woken up believing she belonged to. Sandra, you need to sit down for this conversation, Patricia said. Mom has some things to tell us that are going to change everything we thought we knew about our family. Over the next hour, we repeated the entire revelation process via speakerphone, with Sandra asking the same incredulous questions her siblings had asked and expressing the same mixture of amazement and hurt that characterized their responses. Mom, Sandra said finally, her voice small and distant through the phone speaker. I feel like I don't know you at all. It was the comment I'd been dreading most, because it expressed the fear that had kept me secret for so long. By hiding my capabilities and my success, I'd protected my relationships with my children. But I'd also prevented them from knowing who I really was. You do know me, I said firmly. You know that I love you unconditionally. You know that I'm proud of the adults you've become. You know that I would do anything to support your happiness and success. The money doesn't change any of that. But the deception does, Michael said quietly. It changes how we understand the past 50 years of our relationship. He was right, and I knew it. Every conversation we'd had about my finances, every time they'd worried about my security, every decision they'd made based on their assumptions about my limitations, had been affected by information I'd withheld. I understand why you're hurt, I said, and I understand why you feel deceived. I made choices that prioritized my privacy over your peace of mind, and that wasn't fair to any of you. What happens now? Patricia asked. How do we move forward from here? It was the question I'd been asking myself since the moment I decided to reveal the truth. My children now knew that their mother was not the person they'd thought she was. They knew that she was capable of sophisticated financial management, strategic thinking, and long-term planning on a scale they'd never imagined. They also knew that she was capable of deception, manipulation, and emotional calculation in ways that challenged their fundamental understanding of who she was as a person. Now, I said, we figure out how to have an honest relationship. For the first time in decades, you know the truth about my situation. We can make decisions together based on accurate information rather than assumptions. Starting with whether you actually want to live at Sunrise Manor, Michael said. Starting with whether I want to live at Sunrise Manor, I agreed. And whether the Founders Circle program represents a good investment opportunity, regardless of where I decide to live. As my children prepared to leave that evening, each of them hugged me longer and tighter than they had in years. But there was something different in their embraces, a mixture of love and uncertainty that hadn't been there before. They were hugging a stranger who looked like their mother, a woman whose capabilities and resources they were still struggling to comprehend. The relationship we'd built over the past few months, based on their perception of my vulnerability, had been replaced by something new and undefined. Mom, Patricia said as she stood at my front door, I need some time to process all of this. I understand, I assured her. Take all the time you need. After they left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the financial documents that told the story of my secret life. For the first time in months, I didn't have to hide who I was, or pretend to be less capable than I actually was. But I also didn't know what kind of relationship I would have with my children now that they knew the truth. The performance was over, but I wasn't sure what would replace it. The first phone call came at 6:30 the next morning, jolting me from the deepest sleep I'd had in months. Sandra's voice was tight with emotion as she spoke from her kitchen in Portland, 3 hours behind Chicago time, which meant she'd been awake since before dawn processing what she'd learned. Mom, I've been up all night thinking about everything you told us yesterday, she said without preamble. I need to understand something. When I called you crying about my divorce 3 years ago, when I was scared about my finances and how I was going to manage as a single mother, you let me worry about whether I could afford to keep Emma in private school. You listened to me panic about money while you were sitting on $47 million. The accusation in her voice cut deeper than I'd expected. I'd been so focused on the immediate aftermath of my revelation that I hadn't fully considered how it would reframe every conversation we'd had about financial struggles every moment when my children had faced money-related stress, while believing their mother was barely getting by on a modest pension. "Sandra, I wanted to help you through that situation, but not with money," I said carefully. "I wanted you to discover your own strength, to learn that you could handle whatever life threw at you. If I'd just written you a check, you would never have learned how capable you really are." But I spent months terrified that I couldn't provide for my daughter. I took a second job, Mom. I worked 60-hour weeks and barely saw Emma because I was so afraid of not having enough money. You could have eliminated that fear with a single conversation. I sat on the edge of my bed, watching the sunrise paint my bedroom walls with soft golden light, and felt the full weight of my choices settling around me like a heavy blanket. Sandra was right. I'd allowed my adult children to struggle with financial anxiety while possessing the resources to eliminate their problems entirely. "You're absolutely right to be angry with me," I said. "I made decisions that prioritized my privacy over your peace of mind, and that was selfish." "It wasn't just selfish, Mom. It was cruel. Do you know how many nights I lay awake wondering if I was failing Emma the way I thought Dad failed us when we were kids? Do you know how many times I looked at other mothers who seemed to have everything figured out and felt like I wasn't enough?" The pain in my youngest daughter's voice was unbearable. Sandra had always been the most emotionally open of my children, the one who shared her fears and doubts most readily. She'd trusted me with her vulnerabilities while I'd hidden my strengths from her. "Sandra, you are an extraordinary mother and an extraordinary woman. You raised Emma to be confident and kind and intelligent, and you did it with resources that most single mothers could only dream of. The fact that you succeeded while facing real financial constraints makes your accomplishments more impressive, not less." "But I didn't need to face those constraints," she said, her voice breaking. "You could have helped me, and you chose not to." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that grew cold while I stared out at my backyard and confronted the reality of what my secrecy had cost. I'd been so focused on maintaining my independence and avoiding the complications that wealth brings to family relationships that I'd ignored the complications my secrecy was creating. My children had spent years making decisions based on incorrect information about their family's financial situation. They'd chosen careers, homes, and lifestyles, partly influenced by their belief that they might eventually need to support their aging mother. They'd worried about my future while I was accumulating more wealth than they could spend in several lifetimes. The phone rang again at 8:15, and Michael's name appeared on the caller ID. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about wanting our attention and involvement. I need you to understand something. You didn't need to pretend to be declining to get our attention. You could have just asked us to spend more time with you." "Could I have?" I asked. "When was the last time you visited me just because you wanted to see me, not because you thought I needed something?" The silence on the other end of the line told me that my question had hit its target. My children loved me, but their busy lives had naturally pulled them away from regular contact with their aging mother. They'd made time for me when they believed I needed help, but they hadn't been making time for me just because they enjoyed my company. "That's not fair," Michael said finally. "We've always made time for family dinners and holidays. Scheduled time," I agreed. "Obligatory time. When was the last time one of you called just to chat or dropped by because you were thinking about me?" Another silence, longer this time. "But Mom, that works both ways. When was the last time you called one of us just to chat? When was the last time you shared something exciting that was happening in your life?" He was right, of course. I'd been so focused on maintaining my secret that I'd stopped sharing the parts of my life that brought me joy and satisfaction. My children didn't know about my successful investments because I couldn't talk about my portfolio performance without revealing my wealth. They didn't know about my business relationships because I couldn't explain my meetings with property managers and financial advisors. They didn't know about my strategic thinking because I'd been pretending to be confused by simple decisions. "You're absolutely right," I admitted. "I created the distance I was complaining about." "So what do we do now?" Michael asked. "How do we build a relationship based on honesty when we're all still processing how much we didn't know about each other?" It was the question that had been keeping me awake since my children left the previous evening. The revelation of my wealth was only the beginning of a larger conversation about who we were as individuals and as a family. Maybe we start by having lunch together once a week, not because anyone needs help with anything, but because we genuinely want to spend time together, I suggested. And maybe you start by telling us what your actual day-to-day life looks like, Michael said. I want to know what you do with your time, what you're interested in, what challenges you're facing that aren't related to money or health. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Jennifer Walsh in her corporate office at Meridian Healthcare Corporation, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of downtown Chicago. The meeting had been scheduled before my revelation to my children, but it was taking place in a completely different context now that I no longer needed to maintain my performance as a confused elderly woman. Mrs. Ellis, I have to admit I'm curious about what happened during our coffee meeting, Jennifer said as she poured tea from an elegant ceramic service that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Your children seemed surprised by your financial sophistication. They were surprised because I hadn't shared certain aspects of my background with them, I said, appreciating the diplomatic way she'd phrased her observation. I see. Well, that actually makes our conversation today much more straightforward. I've prepared a complete analysis of the Founders Circle program, including our financial projections and operational metrics. She handed me a bound presentation that was significantly more detailed than anything I'd seen in their marketing materials. The first section outlined Meridian's expansion strategy, their target markets, and their competitive positioning within the senior housing industry. This is impressive, I said, scanning charts that showed revenue growth and occupancy trends across their portfolio. Your performance has been consistently strong despite some industry headwinds. Thank you. We've managed to maintain premium positioning while most of our competitors have been forced to reduce pricing or accept lower occupancy rates. I turned to a section that detailed the Founders Circle program's structure and found that it was even more interesting than I'd initially realized. Members weren't just paying for enhanced amenities. They were essentially becoming limited partners in facility operations, with input into major decisions and profit-sharing arrangements tied to operational performance. The return projections look conservative, I observed, studying charts that showed potential financial benefits for program participants. We prefer to under-promise and over-deliver, Jennifer said. But I should mention that our most successful Founders Circle members have seen returns significantly higher than our published projections. What defines a successful member? Someone who brings both capital and expertise to the relationship. We've found that our best outcomes occur when members have business backgrounds that complement our operational needs. I looked up from the presentation and met Jennifer's eyes directly. What operational needs are you facing that might benefit from additional expertise? Her smile told me that we'd moved from a sales conversation to a business negotiation. Honestly, we're exploring expansion into new markets, but we need partners who understand both real estate investment and senior demographics. Someone with your background could be invaluable in evaluating potential acquisitions. My background. She'd obviously done research that went beyond the basic financial verification most facilities required. What exactly do you know about my background? I know that you own rental properties in 3 states, that you've been making successful real estate investments for decades, and that your portfolio performance suggests a level of expertise that most professional investors would envy. I set down my teacup and leaned back in my chair, reassessing everything about this conversation. Jennifer, are you offering me a place to live, or are you recruiting me as a business partner? I'm hoping we can structure an arrangement that serves both purposes. For the next 2 hours, we discussed possibilities that bore no resemblance to the assisted living conversation I'd anticipated. Jennifer outlined Meridian's plans for expanding into smaller markets, their interest in developing more affordable senior housing options, and their need for partners who could provide both capital and expertise. What we're really looking for, she said as our meeting drew to a close, are people who want to be actively involved in shaping the future of senior living rather than just passively consuming our services. And the Founders Circle program is your testing ground for identifying those people. Exactly. We've found that the residents who thrive in our communities are the ones who remain intellectually and professionally engaged. Retirement doesn't have to mean the end of contributing meaningful expertise to worthwhile projects. I drove home from that meeting with my mind racing in directions I hadn't anticipated. The conversation with Jennifer had revealed possibilities that went far beyond my original questions about assisted living. She was offering me the opportunity to remain professionally active while transitioning to a lifestyle that offered more social interaction and fewer maintenance responsibilities. More importantly, she was offering me the chance to use my expertise in ways that could benefit other seniors, to be part of solutions rather than just a consumer of services. That evening, I called a family meeting. Patricia, Michael, and Sandra gathered in my living room with the same nervous energy they'd brought to our conversation 2 days earlier. But this time I was the one with revelations to share. I met with Jennifer Walsh today, I began, and I learned some things about myself that I want to share with you. I told them about the business conversation, about the opportunity to become involved in senior housing development, about the possibility of using my financial expertise to help create better options for aging adults. So this isn't really about assisted living anymore, Michael observed. This is about a new career. It's about a new phase of life, I corrected. One where I can be honest about my capabilities and use them in ways that feel meaningful. Sandra, who'd been quiet throughout my explanation, finally spoke up. Mom, I'm still angry with you about the secrets and the deception. But I have to admit that hearing you talk about this project, seeing you excited about something new, this is the most like yourself you've sounded in years. What do you mean? I mean, you've been pretending to be smaller than you actually are for so long that I'd forgotten how impressive you are when you're not hiding your intelligence. Patricia nodded in agreement. It's true. Growing up, I remember you always reading, always learning new things, always having opinions about business and politics and economics. Somewhere along the way, you stopped sharing that side of yourself with us. I thought you saw me as just a mother and grandmother, I said. I didn't think you were interested in my opinions about business or economics. We saw you the way you presented yourself to us, Michael said. If you'd been sharing your investment strategies and business insights all along, we would have understood that those were important parts of who you are. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had as a family. For the first time in decades, I talked openly about my interests, my goals, and my plans for the future. I shared my thoughts about economic trends, my analysis of various investment opportunities, and my ideas about how senior housing could be improved to serve people like me who wanted to remain intellectually and professionally active. My children asked questions that revealed their genuine curiosity about my business acumen and their respect for what I'd accomplished. They also expressed their lingering hurt about my deception, but it was balanced by growing excitement about the possibilities that honesty was creating. So are you going to move to Sunrise Manor? Patricia asked. I'm going to consider it seriously, I said, but as a business decision and a lifestyle choice, not as a surrender to aging or decline. And the Founders Circle program? I'm going to evaluate it as an investment opportunity that happens to come with housing benefits. Sandra smiled for the first time since learning about my hidden wealth. This is so much better than watching you pretend to need our help with basic decisions. Even though it means you can't take care of me the way you wanted to? Mom, we can still take care of you. We just can't manage your life for you, which is actually a relief because you're obviously much better at managing it than we are. 3 weeks later, I signed papers that made me a founding member of the Meridian Healthcare Corporation's Expansion Committee and a resident of Sunrise Manor's Premium Founders Circle community. The financial commitment was exactly what Jennifer had outlined. $250,000 up front, plus monthly fees that totaled approximately $6,800. For me, it represented less than 2% of my net worth and approximately 6 months of investment income. For the first time in my adult life, I was making a major life decision based purely on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. The apartment I selected was larger than anything I'd toured during my initial visit. 1,200 square feet with 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and a private balcony overlooking the facility's gardens. I furnished it with pieces I'd always wanted but never bought, artwork that reflected my interests rather than my budget, and technology that supported both my comfort and my business activities. Moving day was an event that involved all 3 of my children, their spouses, and my granddaughter Emma. Watching them pack my belongings and arrange my new space, I was struck by how different our interactions had become since the revelation of my true circumstances. Instead of treating me like someone who needed protection from complex decisions, they were consulting me about everything from furniture placement to technology setup. Instead of speaking about me in the third person, they were speaking directly to me about my preferences and priorities. "Grandma," Emma said as she helped me arrange books on my new shelves, "Mom told me you're like a secret business genius. Is that true?" I looked at my 12-year-old granddaughter, this confident young woman who'd inherited her mother's directness and her grandmother's analytical mind, and realized that I had an opportunity to be completely honest with the next generation. "I'm someone who learned to be smart about money and investments," I said. "And I'm someone who forgot that being smart about some things doesn't mean you have to hide it from people you love." "Are you going to teach me about investing? Would you like to learn?" "Yes. Mom says understanding money is important for independence." As I settled into my new life at Sunrise Manor, I discovered that Jennifer Walsh had been right about the community's emphasis on intellectual engagement. My neighbors included a retired federal judge, a former university president, 2 successful entrepreneurs, and a woman who'd spent 40 years as a foreign correspondent for major newspapers. Our Founders Circle meetings were unlike any business gatherings I'd ever attended. We reviewed operational reports with the insight of people who'd managed complex organizations. We evaluated expansion proposals with the wisdom of experienced investors. We discussed resident satisfaction surveys with the perspective of people who understood both customer service and operational efficiency. "Fanny," Judge Morrison said during our third quarterly meeting, "your analysis of the Milwaukee market opportunity was exactly what we needed to make that decision." "Thank you, Charles. I think that location offers excellent potential for the kind of integrated senior community we've been discussing." It felt extraordinary to be valued for my expertise rather than tolerated for my age. For the first time in years, I was contributing to something meaningful while being recognized for the skills I'd developed over decades of careful learning and strategic thinking. My relationship with my children continued to evolve as we all adjusted to our new dynamic. Weekly family dinners became occasions for genuine conversation rather than dutiful obligation. My children asked for my advice about their own financial decisions, and I shared insights I'd been keeping secret for years. "Mom," Patricia said during one of our dinners, "I've been thinking about what you said about real estate investment. Tom and I are considering buying a rental property, and we'd love your perspective on the market analysis." "I'd be happy to help," I said, feeling a warmth that came from being useful in ways that matched my actual capabilities. Michael started bringing his business challenges to our conversations, seeking input on strategic decisions he was facing at his engineering firm. Sandra began calling me for advice about her own investment strategy and her plans for Emma's college savings. "It's strange," Sandra said during one of our calls, "but I feel like I'm getting to know you for the first time as an adult. I'm seeing sides of you that I never knew existed." "I feel the same way about all of you," I admitted. "For the first time, I'm seeing you as peers rather than just as my children." 6 months into my residency at Sunrise Manor, Jennifer Walsh approached me with a proposal that would change everything again. "Fanny, I want to discuss an opportunity that could benefit both you and Meridian," she said as we sat in my apartment's living room, surrounded by the business reports and financial documents that had become part of my daily routine. "I'm listening. We're considering a significant expansion into planned senior communities, developments that combine independent living with eventual care options as residents age. It's a $20 million project that requires partners who understand both real estate development and senior demographics. And you think I might be interested in participating? I think you might be interested in leading it." Leading it. The phrase sent a thrill through me that I hadn't felt since the early days of building my investment portfolio. What would that involve? Site selection, design consultation, marketing strategy, and operational oversight. You'd essentially be developing the prototype for a new kind of senior living community. At 78 years old? At 78 years old with 50 years of relevant experience and the financial resources to make it happen, I considered the proposal for exactly 30 seconds before I knew my answer. "Jennifer, I'm interested. Very interested." That night, I called my children to share the news about this unexpected opportunity. Their responses revealed how much our relationships had changed since I'd stopped pretending to be less capable than I actually was. "Mom, that sounds amazing," Patricia said. "You've always been good at seeing possibilities that other people miss. Are you sure you want to take on something that complex?" Michael asked, not from concern about my abilities, but from genuine curiosity about my motivations. "I'm sure," I said. "For the first time in decades, I have the chance to build something meaningful while being completely honest about who I am and what I'm capable of." "Then we're behind you 100%, Sandra said. "And we want to be involved in whatever way we can help." As I prepared for sleep that night in my beautiful apartment, surrounded by evidence of a life I'd finally chosen, based on my actual wants rather than my perceived limitations, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. I'd started this adventure by pretending to be declining in order to get my children's attention. I'd ended it by discovering capabilities I hadn't even known I possessed, and building relationships with my family that were deeper and more honest than anything we'd shared before. The greatest fortune I'd built wasn't financial. It was the discovery that being authentic about my strengths was infinitely more rewarding than being protected because of my supposed weaknesses. Tomorrow, I would begin developing plans for a senior living community that would serve people like me, individuals who'd accumulated wisdom, resources, and expertise over long lives, and wanted to remain actively engaged rather than passively cared for. Tomorrow, I would continue being Fanny Ellis, not the confused grandmother my children had worried about, but the strategic thinker and successful investor I'd always been. The performance was over. The real life had finally begun. Emma visited me the following weekend, eager to learn about the investment principles I'd promised to teach her. As we sat at my dining room table with financial reports spread between us, I realized that I was finally able to pass on the most important lesson I'd learned. "Grandma," she said, studying a spreadsheet that tracked one of my rental properties' performance over 10 years, "how did you know this would be a good investment?" "I did research, I asked good questions, and I trusted my analysis even when other people thought I was being too optimistic." "But how did you know to trust yourself?" I looked at my granddaughter, this bright young woman who would inherit a world where women's financial capabilities were more recognized and respected than they'd been during my youth, and smiled. "Emma, the most important thing I can teach you about money is that your intelligence and your instincts are your most valuable assets. Don't ever pretend to be less smart than you actually are, just because it makes other people more comfortable." "Is that what you did? Pretended to be less smart?" "For too many years, yes. But I learned that hiding your capabilities doesn't protect the people you love. It just prevents them from knowing who you really are." As we worked through investment calculations and discussed market analysis, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with financial returns and everything to do with authentic connection. For 78 years, I'd been Fanny Ellis. For the first time, I was finally being myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.